Back to plants. So, I want to go through sort of the diversity of the plant world. We're going to start with the simplest plants. Simplest plants on land. We're not going to go all the way back on the algae. And there are three major evolutionary adaptations that characterize the phylogeny of plants. One is vascular tissue, which allows plants to move water from the roots, from the roots to the shoots, from the roots to the shoots. Second is the seed. Seed is one of the coolest adaptations of all time. We'll learn more about the seed later. And the last one is the flower. Okay. So, start with the mosses, the bryophytes. Mosses have none of these. Mosses, no flowers, no seeds, no vascular tissue. They're super simple. They're just little thingies. Matter of fact, most people don't even think of moss as plants. Moss, moss tend to be what we call epiphytes. Epi means on top of or around, phyte is a plant. Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants. So moss growing on a tree is an epiphyte. Okay? Moss need to live near water for two reasons. One, they lack vascular tissue to transport water up through their bodies. And two, for sex. So the way they reproduce is they release sperm into the water and it has to swim to another moss. Okay? So they actually have mobile sperm that swim from moss to moss.
When we're talking vascular tissue, are we talking just that piece that transports the water, or are we also talking about like the leaves that have the respiration piece as well?
These leaves still do photosynthesis and respiration, but they lack so they have the cells for photosynthesis and respiration. They lack the tissue to transport water long distances through the body. So they lack a vascular system, right? They lack the tissues that create an actual organ system. Mosses are ecologically kind of interesting. They capture a lot of seeds, and a lot of things will grow in the mosses because they create a habitat in which stuff can grow. Very few things eat mosses. The only two things I can think of off the top of my head are tardigrades, however you pronounce them, water bears. These are the things that can survive at like minus 200 degrees Celsius. Like these little water bears. You know water bears? You know what I'm talking about?
No.
Yeah. What?
Do they actually look like bears?
Wait a second. Sorry about that. They kind of look like bears. Tardigrade. Yeah, tardigrades. So they eat mosses, and the other animal I know of that eats moss are bears. Bears eat, so moss are really hard to digest, that's why most things don't eat them. Bears eat moss before they hibernate, and the moss acts as a big suppository. And it's a big old butt plug that keeps them from pooping themselves while they're hibernating for 6 months. Because you can only imagine how upset you would be if you've woken up 6 months later, you haven't eaten in 6 months, you're super cold, super hungry, and you've pooped yourself. So one of the first bowel movements that bears make is just like full of moss. It's just like.
But the reason we you have fecal matter, why you have that whole system is so that your body can get rid of toxins. So if the bears can't do that, then do the toxins stay in their system?
For a long period of time, yeah.
Okay.
Well, but they're hibernating, so their metabolism's like super slow,
Oh.
super slow.
So they're barely making any food?
What's that?
So they're barely making any feces then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So, remember I mentioned that, remember that alternative generation we talked about last week? Remember that? Okay. So mosses, when you look at a moss, it's actually a haploid organism. And it is only when it reproduces with these sporangia that it produces that sporophyte. So this is a gametophyte. This thing you see is gametophyte. It's a haploid, one set of DNA organism. Okay. All right, I'm not going to spend a ton of time. There are a couple other plants in the same phylum of the mosses called liverworts, which are kind of cool. Hornworts, kind of cool. And the mosses. And that's it. Okay. Now, then come plants that have vascular tissue, but they still don't have seeds and they don't have cells. These are the pteridophytes, aka the ferns. Ferns and their allies. Ferns, whisk ferns, horsetails, pterophytes an old word. I'll use pterophyte. Well, I learned this back in the dark ages. We called them pteridophytes. That's it. There was actually a pteridomania back in the Victorian England in the 1800s. Everybody got really into ferns. Why? Ferns are cool. Okay, so some cool, so these things actually now have vascular tissue, so they can grow big, they can grow tall. There were, back during the Carboniferous era, there were these huge, what are called lycophytes. Lycophytes still exist now, but they're really small. They only grow about that big. Back during the Carboniferous, there would be giant 40, 50, 60 foot lycophyte trees that grew like all the way up. We know this because many of them became coal. So these massive swamps of the Carboniferous that were made out of a lot of these lycophytes is what we now burn to make energy, is coal. And you'll find like fossilized versions of them in the coal. We're able to identify them. It's kind of neat. We still have tree ferns today. I took this photo in Australia back in 2012. That's a 30-foot tall fern. Isn't that cool? And again, ferns can do that because they have vascular tissue that is able to move water from the ground all the way up to the top of the tree. Heavy. Oh, here's a lycophyte. I should move these slides around. It's a little lycophyte. This is known as Prince's Pine. It's called Prince's Pine because it tends to grow underneath pine trees. It's illegal to harvest these. They're protected under the Christmas Tree Act because people were harvesting things for Christmas. People like these. Can't harvest those. All right. Some other interesting ones: the whisk ferns. Kind of rare. Tend to find those in desert areas. Horsetails are seedless vascular plants as well. Horsetails are they're an invasive native plant. So usually when we think, they're an invasive native plant. Usually when we think of invasive plants, they're non-natives, but horsetails are native to the Pacific Northwest, but people don't like them. For whatever reason, they don't like them growing in their lawns. So they try to get rid of them. 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 Horsetail, you guys know, you've seen horsetails. They grow here on campus over at Building 9, what's over there. They have another name, scouring rush. So when Europeans came out here, they would use these things to scrub their pots because they have a lot of silica in their tissue. That silica was a defense against herbivory, against dinosaur herbivores back in the day. These are other things that go way back to the Carboniferous. Also used to grow really big and tall, big tree, equisetum. Today they don't grow that big. Some do get, there's a giant equisetum that grows around here, it's about yay tall, and but that's what I'm thinking. Okay. Now we move on to the gymnosperms. All right. Gymnosperm. Sperm means seed. Gym. Everybody know what gym means? Back in ancient Rome, when you went to the gym, you know what you study language. What gym means? What made the gym the gym? Anybody know? Yeah.
Everyone got naked.
That's exactly right.
Really?
Yeah, it's funny. Like, this is a great example of the importance of culture. So, you see those old the bas relief and the artwork of these Romans engaged, the Greeks engaged in athletic competition. They're all naked, right? You would think that they walked around naked. They didn't. They wore clothes. They didn't go to battle naked. They didn't go to the store naked. They had clothes. But when they engaged in, sport, they got naked. Which to us is totally bizarre, but to them was just well, of course you get naked. I should say, when I did the Spartan race, no, it was 40 degrees and raining. I was not getting naked. But the elites, the ones who won, they were they just wore the guys were bare chested, the women just wore sports bras, and that was it. They just wore tight shorts, and that's all they wore. I was dang. Okay, so these are the first plants that make seeds. Yeah.
So for the first two types, how do they, what's their main method of reproduction without seeds?
So let's talk about what a seed is. Seed is a baby in a box with a latch. The seed is one of the most important evolutionary steps of life on this planet. What you have in a seed is you have the embryonic plant, the embryonic spore plant, and it's alive. Seeds are actually alive. They're in suspended animation. They're have you seen the movie Interstellar or The Martian? When they put people to sleep for long periods of time and they slow down their metabolism? That's what seeds are. This little embryo in there, it's alive. It's doing all the things that living organisms do, it's just doing it very, very slowly. And it's inside this seed coat, which is a specially evolved box to keep it nice and safe, but that's able to be opened under just the right conditions. Okay? It has special locks that can be opened under the right conditions. And then there is extra food, there's some food in there called nutritive tissue. It's called endosperm. Endosperm meaning inside of the seed. And the reason that it has a nutritive tissue is when the seed first starts growing, it does not have leaves. It cannot do photosynthesis, so it can't produce energy, can't produce ATP by photosynthesis. So it has some stored sugars, some stored starches, and that provides energy for it to start growing. Now what's amazing about seeds is that they can last for very, very, very long times. We found seeds in Mayan ruins, in ancient Egypt, that have germinated after thousands of years. They can last for a super, super long time. Because they can last so long, they can also be transported very far distances. And this is one of the big things about, so there's a fundamental problem that plants have, right? They can't move. And so if I'm a tree and I reproduce, and I reproduce my babies drop down underneath me. And there's some plants that do this, I'm not saying plants still do this, but there's a problem with that, right? So if my babies fall down here, what do my babies need to grow?
Light.
They need light, but I'm shading them out. right? They need water, but my roots are already established. I'm sucking all the water out of the ground. They need nutrients, but I'm absorbing that too. They need space, but I'm taking up the space. It's problematic. But plants can't move, right? Can't move on their own. So the seed allows the little embryonic plant the ability to live long enough while it can be transported someplace else. So we'll learn about this process known as seed dispersal. Plants have evolved all sorts of different mechanisms for seed dispersal, getting the seed to move away from the parent. Anybody like to go hiking? When you come back from hiking, you ever find stuff on your socks?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's one method of seed dispersal. They're called hitchhikers. And what's happened is on the seed coat, they've developed little hooks. And those hooks cause the seed to get attached to an animal, right? Usually a mammal. And it'll carry it off somewhere and it'll be deposited someplace else. That's how Velcro was invented, by the way. There was a dude hiking and he was like, oh, that's a cool idea. Okay, so the seed. Other question about the seed? No? Other cool thing about the seed, as I mentioned before, it can only be opened under certain conditions. Usually, the main condition that causes seeds to open is water. Right? If there's a lot of water, the water will hydrolyze the proteins on the seed coat, and that will cause it to crack open. And then once that happens, it'll start germinating and growing. If you can keep seeds dry, they can last for a very, very long time. Now, why would you think water would be a key to the germination of a seed? Yeah?
It tells it that it's in a good environment to grow.
Exactly, right? If there's enough water for it to crack open that seed coat, this must be a good place because there's enough water on it. All right. Okay. Seeds. Oh, that's just, okay. All right. So the modern gymnosperms, they're all woody species. We'll learn about wood later on. Wood is a special adaptation that certain plants have. It's a type of xylem. It's a type of vascular tissue. All right. So these are the current, we'll call extant gymnosperms: cycads, ginkgos, neophytes, and conifers. Conifers are by far the most common. Cycads are found usually in the tropics. You'll also see these. People like to put them in like the lobbies of hotels for whatever reason. Yeah, they're super toxic. They're full of, well, I shouldn't say super toxic, but they're full of all these anti-predatory. They're full of these secondary metabolites. They're not easily eaten. Nothing likes to eat them, and that's because they got preyed on a lot during the Mesozoic, and now they're not, like, we don't use them for anything. They're just decorative. They don't have a common purpose. Okay, ginkgos. We've got ginkgos here on campus. I'll show you guys ginkgos. Who's heard of ginkgo? Ginkgo biloba. Ginkgo biloba is a dietary supplement that people use for memory. That's right. Use it for memory. Ginkgo is also known as the maidenhair tree because it has this maidenhair-shaped leaf. This is the leaf here. It supposedly looks like the hair of a maiden. I don't know. Ginkgos are what we call dioecious plants, meaning they have separate sexes. There are male ginkgo trees and female ginkgo trees. And my wife's very good friend recently got a ginkgo tree that's a female ginkgo. So it will produce ginkgo berries, which is a really bad idea. Because ginkgo berries have this stuff in them called butyric acid, which smells like vomit. My college planted a bunch of ginkgos right outside of one of the cafes on campus. That was stupid. Because I think it was in the late spring, the berries would fall to the ground and you'd step on it and you'd walk into the cafe smelling like vomit. Ginkgos are used a lot in cities because they can tolerate air pollution. They're very, very hardy, robust species. There is only one living species in the entire phylum, and that is Ginkgo biloba. There used to be others, but they've gone extinct. Neophytes. Neophytes are kind of cool. There are 3 neophytes. One is ephedra, which we have growing in our native plant garden. One is Needham, which is a tropical tree. And the third one is this plant called Welwitschia, which is only found in the Kalahari Desert, and it has 2 leaves. It's this huge plant, and it's just 2 leaves, but they're really big. Anyway. The most common gymnosperms are the conifers. Right? These are the cone-bearing trees, Coniferophyta. We have a lot of these around here. This is Washington is known as the evergreen stick. So evergreens are conifers. This is me down in such a dork. This is in Chile. I'm hiking through a forest of monkey trees. And we have a monkey tree here on campus. We'll take a look at this when we do our walk on in lab. Monkey trees are South American conifers. We'll look at them. They're pretty neat because instead of having needles or scales, they have these like blades on them. Kind of wild. It's the same basic structure. It's just evolved differently. What a dork. Okay. So conifers have cones. They do not have flowers. Cones kind of like a flower. Some cones produce pollen, and pollen is the male gametophyte. You know, this time of year, actually, you'll get a lot of pollen on your car if you park underneath some of these conifer trees. And yeah, that's if you have hay fever right now, it could be from conifer pollen. Though I have to say, usually the hay fever is not produced by the pollen that you can see, it's produced by the pollen that you can't see, like the grass pollens. They're really, really small. Anyway, the pollen's produced and it's carried by the wind. It just gets blown away by the wind, and it will land on a female cone. When that pollen lands on the female cone, it germinates, forms a pollen tube, and then these sperm cells grow down, and then they fertilize the egg. We'll get into this more in depth when we get to the flowering plants. And then you get a seed, and there you go. Questions on that? We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about gyms. Yeah.
I guess the conifers are actually woody bark, right?
They're woody. Yeah, they're all woodies. Yep.
Well, the ferns, though, you said they can grow up to 60 feet tall.
They do that without wood, just like palm trees. So palm trees don't have wood either, but they can still grow like 80 feet tall.
They have like scale like,
No, they're like an incredibly compact grass. So like bamboo, for example, doesn't have wood. Bamboo is literally a grass. It's just really, really tightly compacted together. Same thing with palm trees. Palm trees.
What are palm trees?
What's that?
If they're not wood, then what are they?
So we'll get into what wood is secondary xylem. Wood is a very specific type of xylem. It's just a bunch of. We'll get into it in a little bit, but it's a bunch of ground tissue and vascular tissue put together. But it's wood. Wood is the secondary xylem that's reinforced by a whole group of compounds called lignins that creates its structure. This is just like a bunch of grass. Like you can think of a palm tree as taking. So think of grass as a straw, right? Think of grass as a straw. A palm tree is just taking like a bunch of straws and compacting it all together. That's what it is. Whereas what wood is it's not growth just up, but growth out as well. So instead of just growing straight up and down like this, wood actually grows out like that, and it gives the plant girth and bulk. We'll get into that more later on.
is that why palm trees generally don't get super wide? Like they're pretty narrow?
Yeah, you can think of it like that. It's why they're super flexible. They can really bend a lot. Yeah.
So the wood is denser than the trees maybe? Is that what you're saying?
Depends on how the tree grows. Like tropical hardwoods, because they don't have growing seasons, they're super, super dense. With the trees that we have around here, because they grow during the summertime, they go dormant in the wintertime, they get those growth rings in them, and so they're not as dense. That depends on the tree. Yeah.
For the seeds, do all seeds need to be fertilized before they can germinate?
Be fertilized?
Or like they need to have pollen go onto them?
So let's back up. So this is an egg, right? So that's like an egg from an ovary,
Okay.
right? So the egg gets fertilized by the sperm from the pollen. We're gonna get into this more with the plants, with the flowers. But the sperm from the pollen fertilizes the egg inside of the ovary. That fertilized egg becomes a zygote. That zygote becomes the embryo inside of the seed.
Oh. So the seed never touches like the seed.
The seed's a
doesn't
little baby.
need
It's a
pollen,
baby.
It's already ready.
It's already, a seed is a baby plant.
Okay.
But in the cones, though, you say you have some cones that produce pollen, which would be like a sperm, but then you have the female one, and then do the female cones then have seeds within them?
Yeah. Sorry. You'll see, man, I've got a cough. You'll see squirrels or chipmunks with a pine cone, with a cone, and they'll tear it apart, and what they're doing is they're getting the seeds out of it. So the seeds themselves, this is a female cone. We got some big ones in there, I can show you guys. But the scales of the cone open up and the seeds on the inside, and as it grows, the seeds will fall out. Or again, an animal will come in and eat the seeds, or it'll take the seeds and carry them away and store them for wintertime, and then this is kind of cool. Squirrels will store seeds and then forget where they stored them, and then those seeds will grow into plant, yeah. Or the squirrel will die or something else. But yeah, so have you noticed this before on conifers? Like when we were looking at the pine tree the other day, the short pine, there are different male cones and different female cones. Male cones are little ones, female cones are big ones. Okay, then the angiosperms. Angiosperms check all three boxes. These are the flowering plants. They have flowers. Flowers are pretty. The flowering plants are the most speciose group of all plants. And that is due to reproductive isolating mechanisms, right? So what the flower is, remember the flower is the plant's junk. It's how it reproduces. It has most flowers are hermaphrodites. They've got male and female parts. And they often have very specific relationships with animals, birds or insects. And those specific relationships create barriers, right? So if you can only be pollinated by one specific type of bee, then you will fundamentally be reproductively isolated from a different plant that is only pollinated by a different kind of bee. Does that make sense? Because of that reason, the flowering plants are the most speciose, most types of species, group of plants, and insects are the most speciose group of animals because of this coevolution that they've engaged in together. Kind of cool. And why do plants use insects, animals in general, to help them reproduce? They can't move themselves. Very good. All right, all different types of cool flowering plants. This is Mount Rainier, by the way. Mount Rainier, paradise. Grasses are actually flowering plants as well. They produce pollen, but it's just they're wind pollinated. They produce pollen that blows in the air. This time of year, a lot of people have grass allergies because the grass is starting to bloom. Some angiosperms are parasites. This is monotropa. We find this here in the Northwest. I think I mentioned this before. It's totally white because it's lost its chlorophyll because it sucks sugars out of other plants. All right. Where are we at? Okay. All right. So there is a traditional grouping of the flowering plants. between the dicots and the monocots. Have you ever heard these terms before, monocots and dicots? It's not, as you can see, oh, this is great. Is this a monophyletic grouping, a paraphyletic grouping, or a polyphyletic grouping?
Because I think arrow is the second and third combined.
Is it? So is it monophyletic? No, right? Because it doesn't include the ancestor and all the descendants. Is it polyphyletic, including individuals from different phylogenies? No. It's paraphyletic because it's leaving out these guys over here, right? The true grouping should be this whole thing, but it's leaving out the magnolias. But it's actually it's a useful distinction, and we'll learn about monocots and dicots. When you start to identify the plants, I'm going to be like, is that a monocot or a dicot? It's kind of a useful distinction. It's not evolutionary, but it's useful. Okay. All right. We'll start with the monocots. So monocots include things like the grasses. Wheat is a monocot. Tulips and lilies are monocots. And orchids, which are some of the coolest plants out there, are monocots. Monocots. Skip over here. Oh, I'll have it. Monocots. Sorry about that. Monocots, the leaves of monocots, the veins run parallel to each other. The flower are either bilaterally symmetrical, like you see here in this orchid, or they have 3 or 6 petals in their flowers. Okay. Whereas dicots, their flowers tend to have 4 or 5 parts. Their leaves have branching veins in them, and dicots form wood. Monocots can't form wood. So if it has wood, it's a dicot. Okay. Where does the term monocot and dicot come from? The first leaves that come out of a seed are called cotyledons. Monocots have how many cotyledons? Good. Dicots have 2. All right. Oh, that's it. That's all I got here. Okay. So as I mentioned before, there's this cool co-evolution. And don't worry about. We're going to go more in depth into those things. It's just sort of. I'm putting it out there, and then we're going to go back into it more later. Okay. Cool adaptations with the co-evolution. What's going on here? A bat is doing what? What's that? It's pollinating, very good. So the bat is getting nectar, and in the process it's picking up pollen on its face. And so when it goes to another plant, what does it do? It delivers that pollen. Good. This is cool. This hawk moth, it's hard to see here, but the proboscis of the hawk moth is that long. And it has this huge, it's this orchid that is only pollinated by this moth. It has this massively long nectarine. And nobody knew what pollinated it. Darwin actually said it's got to be an insect with a huge proboscis. And he figured it was probably a moth because moths are active at night. And that's probably why nobody's seen it before. It's active at night. They finally figured it out. As I mentioned, talking to you guys about this, birds, they like red colors. So if you see birds like red colors, and they can't smell. Most birds have no sense of smell. So if you see a red-colored flower with no scent, it's usually bird pollinated. I also mentioned that insects, bees in particular, can see into the ultraviolet. So this is what this marigold flower looks like to a bee, right? Much more patterning. And notice See all these lines here? Where do they point? That way. See, this is like a bullseye. The flower is telling the insect, this is where you need to go. Well, seriously, when we look at we're gonna dissect some flowers in lab, and when we do that, we'll see that many of these petals are actually set up like runways or landing strips for airplanes. They've got these lines and colors that point the bee like, go this way, right? This is where you go, okay? That's it for today. See you guys in lab.